Hi everyone, Jeff Gianola, welcome to another KOIN conversation here on the KOIN Plus app. And I have got one of my favorite guests, and I think you're going to agree once you hear what he has to say. You know, here in Portland, when we look around this beautiful city, we just love the buildings. Now there's some buildings we love more than others, and there's a beautiful shot of the skyline right there. You see down in the corner, you see the Portland building there. A lot of controversy with that, but that's sure a unique building. But what are your favorite buildings? That's some of the stuff I'm going to talk about with my guest, Brian Libby, who's sort of a freelance journalist who writes about architecture and art. And Brian, how do you describe yourself?
Well, I think you're off to a pretty good start, Jeff. I'm a writer, and my main focus is architecture. I dabble a little bit in visual art and film when I can. But I think really even more than architecture, I love writing about cities, and this city in particular. I have a book coming out next year called In Search of Portland that's really about walking through the city and talking about great places that I love. And I've spent about the past 25 years writing about architecture for a few different newspapers and magazines, kind of whoever will have me, anyone from a tiny little website to the New York Times to the Oregonian to Portland Monthly magazine, and I just really love doing what I do and talking to creative people, especially architects, but also artists, about what they do.
Well, I invited you here because I want to talk about, you know, people say, oh, I've got a favorite building that I love, and there's a whole list of your favorite buildings, I know that, but I asked you to kind of pick 5 for some unique reasons, and I think this is going to surprise a lot of people. Let's start with building number 1, and that is Memorial Coliseum, the old Memorial Coliseum. And some folks say, well, shouldn't that be torn down? I mean, you know, we've already got the Moda Center, and shouldn't Memorial Coliseum, what's so special about that? And you have been a champion for Memorial Coliseum for a long time in preserving it. Why is that? Why is it such a jewel in this city?
Well, I can understand why people might find it surprising and that it's a little bit unprecedented, because very few cities ever preserve the stadiums and arenas that a professional sports team abandons, you know, and people have said to me, well, they tore down Yankee Stadium, they'll tear down anything. Why should we keep this building? And I also think it's true that some of the best things about the Coliseum from an architectural standpoint are kind of hiding. Like, you see it from the outside and it is this kind of pristine glass box, and they even originally considered calling it the Glass Palace. But what's really great about it from an experiential standpoint is what it's like to be inside. It's really one of a kind in the world, but it has a feature that has been hidden away for most of its history. It's, as best I can tell, the only arena in the world that allows you to have a view to the outside from your seats in this seating bowl. And I even once, I think during a Blazers exhibition game many years ago, watched the sunset over the downtown Portland skyline from my seats. However, there is a black curtain that has become kind of the default that has closed off that view for most of the building's history. It's an operable curtain, but now it's such an old building that they hardly ever open it, kind of for some special occasions like the Rose Parade every year in June, maybe a Winterhawks daytime hockey game now and then.
So you would describe the building sort of as a glass jewel box with a bowl kind of plopped down in the middle of it, right?
Precisely, and it's actually the simplicity that makes it great. Like, you have this 10,000 seat concrete seating bowl that sits completely untouched by the glass box around it. And then the building itself is the equivalent of something like 3 city blocks, but the whole thing stands on 4 columns. There are more than 4 columns in my tiny little house where I came from today. And so it's just kind of this incredible, elegant simplicity. And it's by one of the great American architecture firms of the 20th century called Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, who were kind of the premier skyscraper designer of the mid-century.
Well, didn't they do Big Pink?
Absolutely. They did a few buildings here in downtown Portland. Even though we're a relatively small city and a lot of their work was in New York and Chicago, they happened to have opened an office in Portland in the 1950s, and they went on to design a number of buildings here in Oregon. Big Pink, as you said. There are a few other office buildings they designed, as well as Autzen Stadium in Eugene.
Wow, interesting. I didn't know about Autzen Stadium. That's neat. One more thing about Memorial Coliseum. People say, well, now we have the Moda Center. Isn't it it interesting, Brian, that they now say the Moda Center is one of the oldest arenas in the NBA? I mean, it just seems like yesterday it opened as the Rose Garden.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's kind of an eye opener. It makes me realize how old I am. But I kind of sometimes joke that the Moda Center was designed by Fred Flintstone. Like you look at it from the outside, and it's just like all this concrete, and you can barely see inside. And I think ultimately whether we keep buildings or whether or not they go away, part of that has to do with their functionality, but also are they beloved? And people love the Coliseum. My mom saw the Beatles play in Memorial Coliseum. And I'm enough of a Blazers fan that I think of the Coliseum as sacred ground because our Blazers won the 1977 championship there.
Absolutely, you're right about that. Hey, let's move on to another interesting building, and we go up into the West Hills to the Japanese Garden. And tell me what your favorite building there is and why.
Well, of course, when we think of the Japanese garden, we don't think of buildings traditionally. We think of this beautiful garden itself. I believe it's the largest Japanese garden in the United States outside of Japan. And in 2017, however, they built a series of a kind of little small campus of buildings called the Cultural Crossing. And Portland traditionally is not a city that has had many famous architects from out of town come here and do work, but this project was designed by a famous Japanese architect named Kengo Kuma, and he is probably best known today for designing Japan's national stadium that was for the 2020 Olympics, and I believe it was the first major stadium in the world built out of wood. And so Kengo Kuma is just a really special architect, and it's not to say that it overshadows the wonderful garden there. That's still the primary focus, but these buildings, the Cultural Village, Cultural Crossing, it's also been called, they're really this wonderful fusion of tradition and contemporary. You go there and they look a little bit like an ancient Japanese pagoda, but they have these pristine lines, and there's a sod roof that is kind of interesting, sustainable move, and there's a little bit of a shared DNA with what we were saying about the Coliseum, and that there is this elegant simplicity there. And you go inside the buildings, and they're just full of light, and they may really are nestled into the hillside in a special way. There's a little tea house you can go in, and granted, there is part of me going like, "Can I get an espresso?" And they shake their heads no. But it's just like the tea house is kind of cantilevered over the hillside, where you feel like you're looking out through the treetops, and it's just like a wonderful experience. You really feel like you're in Japan, and it's just like a wonderful place to be, this combination of buildings and garden.
And I think Kuma, the reason he agreed to do the architecture for that building was he was so stunned at how beautiful this Japanese garden was. He thought it rivaled anything in Japan.
It's really a unique place. I think we have in Portland this wonderful kind of experience of the forest in the city. We have it with Forest Park, which is near the Japanese Garden, which is the largest urban wilderness in the United States, and you get a little bit of that flavor with Washington Park and the area where the Japanese Garden is, where the old zoo used to be. This feeling of the forest in the city, and also I think Oregon shares a similar climate to some of Japan, and so it was a wonderful thing, I believe, in the 1950s when they built the Japanese Garden. It's kind of amazing to think about that it was only a decade or more after World War II, and yet you had this kind of these former warring nations coming together and really building something together in a wonderful kind of collaboration between nations, which is something to learn about in today's times as well.
Well, let's move into downtown Portland now, and one of my favorite buildings, and Brian, that would be the Portland Art Museum, designed by Pietro Belluschi, who, as many people know, I did a documentary on in the 1990s that is run on OPB, and the Portland Art Museum is a big part of that documentary. And what makes that Portland Art Museum so special, Brian?
Well, I'll start by saying I could have chosen a number of Pietro Belluschi buildings for this top 5 list. And when you and I were talking about this conversation earlier, we had bandied about the possibility of choosing Belluschi's Equitable Building, now called the Commonwealth Building, which is sometimes described as the nation's first modern office building from the late 1940s. It was the first one to have a kind of glass curtain wall, as it's called, which really every office building in America started to look like afterwards, but it was really the first of its kind. But I chose the Portland Art Museum because it's where I've spent the most time, and that it really is a kind of big bang for Pietro Belluschi. He's the most famous architect that has ever come out of Portland. Granted, he was born and raised in Italy, but he spent most of his adult life and career here in Portland, and this is really the building that put him on the map. He had been working for another locally famous architect, A.E. Doyle, who we'll get to later on the list. But in 1931, Pietro Belluschi had the chance to design the art museum himself. And the trustees for the Portland Art Museum were skeptical at first. They were saying, who's this guy? He's just an employee in A.E. Doyle's firm. And, he's telling us that he wants to design a modern building. And here we are in 1930, 1931, and we're not so sure about doing something modern. And so it took a lot of convincing to get the trustees to agree both to letting this heretofore unknown architect, Pietro Belluschi, have a chance, and then to follow his vision and do something modern. But it's a great story. You already know this, of course, as someone who's done a documentary about Belluschi. But the trustees were trying to get Pietro to do this kind of traditional style or kind of Georgian style building, following the lead, the inspiration of Central Library down the street. Looks like a kind of Roman temple or something. And Pietro Belluschi kind of pulled a kind of smooth move. He wrote to the world's most famous architect of the time, Frank Lloyd Wright, and asked for his help convincing the Portland Art Museum trustees. And he sent Frank Lloyd Wright his drawings for the museum, and it worked. He got Frank Lloyd Wright to write a letter back, which was shared with the trustees. I think it began, "My dear Belluschi," and Frank Lloyd Wright went on to say that this would be an advance for the culture of Portland, and it convinced the Portland Art Museum trustees to go ahead. And so what you have in this Portland Art Museum is it's a different kind of modern than you have in Memorial Coliseum from the 60s, which is all about glass and steel and transparency. The Portland Art Museum, in retrospect, even though Belluschi had to try and convince them to do something modern, to today's eyes, it's really a fusion of traditional and modern. And he was born and raised in Italy, where you had a lot of masonry buildings, and there is a kind of elegant symmetry to the Portland Art Museum and a use of materials like travertine marble and brick that can feel kind of traditional to today's eyes. But I just love going there also. When I made this list, I tried to think of buildings that I love being inside, not that just look good when you take a picture of them from the street outside, but it's a great place to view art. Like there are a lot of windows up above, I think that architects would call clerestory windows, where it's not a window shining right at you at eye level, but it kind of creates this kind of skylight situation, not from directly above, but from up these corners up near the ceiling. And with art, you have to be careful not to shine direct light onto these paintings, but Belluschi found a way to introduce a lot of natural light into this building without harming the art.
It becomes not the country's, but the world's first modern art museum. And I guess after that, Belluschi kind of toured the world as an advisor, telling people, how to, design and build a modern art museum. So, but what amazes me about that building, like a lot of Belluschi's buildings, it's hard to date. You think he probably started working on that in the late 20s, 30, his ideas for that. And if you look at that building, I know there's a lot of remodeling going on now and stuff, but the basic structure of the building is there. If you look at the front of that building, you could say, well, maybe this was built in the 60s, maybe even the 70s, a little modern design. But to think that is 1930, 1931 is pretty incredible.
Yeah. The best architecture is timeless. I think it's wonderful to see how, even though it was really originally a quite tiny little building, they've found ways to build onto it a number of times. Really, like every generation has expanded and left a different kind of mark on the building. And now more than ever, they are really changing things. They are building a building between two buildings. You have the Portland Art Museum owning the former Masonic Temple next door, which they kind of remodeled for the Art Museum a generation ago. And now they're building a kind of glass connector between them, the Rothko Pavilion, set to open in November, I believe. And, Beluski's original building has just sort of evolved with the times. And I think that's one of the marks of a great design, along with its beauty and functionality.
They're not tearing it down, they're adding to it,
Uh-huh.
which is pretty cool. Well, let's move on. Are we at number 4 coming up, I think? And that would be, we just talked about it, A.E. Doyle's Central Library. And we all know what that looks like, an elegant, building, sort of the kind of building that anchors downtowns. You think of a city's past. And tell us about A.E. Doyle and the Central Library.
Well, A.E. Doyle was Pietro Beluschi's boss, for one thing. But if Pietro was the most important Portland architect of the maybe latter half of the 20th century, or from the 1930s and 40s onward, A.E. Doyle was really the most significant Portland architect of the first few decades of the 20th century. And there's a number of buildings in the central city and beyond that are landmarks that were designed by A.E. Doyle. For example, the Benson Hotel was Doyle. The Meyer and Frank building, what I guess is now the Nines Hotel, and the entire Reed College campus. And so A.E. Doyle was, I think the biography of Doyle is actually called Portland's Architect. And so he was really a giant in his own right. He never became as nationally famous as Beluski, but so many of the great old buildings that we treasure are A.E. Doyle. And Central Library is probably the one that you would more than any call his masterpiece. It's interesting in a few different ways. It's a kind of temple in that it really channels kind of classical architecture, but it was actually quite innovative in its time as well. The story of that building relates not just to A.E. Doyle, but to the head librarian of the time, a woman named Mary Frances Isom. And she was really innovative about how the library would work. Like, this was actually one of the first libraries in America to simply allow the patrons to peruse the book stacks themselves. Like, it used to be that you would go to a counter and if you wanted to check out a book, someone would go and get it for you. They wouldn't let you put your hands on the shelves and pull a book off the stack. Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And so it's just a wonderful place to be. And, libraries have really had to evolve a lot. Like today, libraries are community centers as much as a place where you go check out a book. It's a place for people to get internet access or to meet each other. And so it's also interesting the way this building has evolved with the times. When I moved to Portland, back to Oregon in 1997 from New York City, Central Library was being renovated then. And at the time, a lot of the beautiful qualities had been kind of covered up, like they had lowered the ceilings and taken away all the beautiful chandeliers and that kind of thing. And so it was kind of being uncovered and restored to some of its original beauty when I moved here. And then more recently, it's gone through another renovation just in the last year or two. And like we said about the Portland Art Museum, it has really found a way to evolve with the times. And as libraries have changed, it too has changed. And yet it has retained that beauty. And I think it's just a wonderful place to hang out and to be. Like you have these big open volume reading rooms where they're just a wonderful place to hang out. Like, sometimes if I have a meeting downtown or something like that, I love to just hang out there and be under the chandeliers and it's another one with these beautiful skylights and light pouring in. And, I remember in the late 90s, Seattle was getting a lot of attention because they were building a big, fancy new from the ground up library by a famous architect of the time, a Dutch architect named Rem Koolhaas, who was kind of like the big hotshot architect of the time. And Portland was renovating its old library, and I remember thinking then that I wouldn't trade. Even though Seattle's Central Library that this guy designed is wonderful in its own right, I wouldn't trade it. I think Central Library is beautiful, and it says something about Portland that we're a little bit more inclined towards historic preservation, and we don't really necessarily build big trophy buildings that are meant to, gain attention from the rest of the world. Like, I'm proud to live in a city that is likely to renovate an old building like Central Library as it is to build a kind of attention-seeking trophy.
Well said. Let's move on to our fifth building, and then we'll talk about a few other things. And this one kind of surprised me because I didn't think this would be on your list, but when you explained why, I see why. We're talking about the Wyden and Kennedy headquarters building, and that's located in, would you call that the Pearl?
Yeah. Yeah. It's only a couple of blocks from Powell's Books, and it's really close to the Brewery Blocks development and the wonderful old Portland Armory. Wyden and Kennedy is interesting in a few ways. One of which is just the Wyden and Kennedy advertising agency. Portland is a small city, but for a long time we had what was arguably the top advertising agency in America. Of course, best known for Just Do It and all the Nike commercials, like all those Michael Jordan commercials, like some of them with Spike Lee. And then Wyden Kennedy has also done a lot of commercials for Coca-Cola and, Bud Light and any number of other big advertising clients. And so they're an inherently interesting creative company as well. And this company needed a big headquarters, and they too took a chance on an architect who wasn't very well known at the time, but who ended up making his name with this project, a Portland architect by the name of Brad Klopfel. And his firm was called Allied Works. And he wasn't known for much at the time. He was a young architect, but he got an interview with them when they were interviewing architects for the job, and he really just kind of charmed and dazzled them. He started drawing and talking about what was possible. And he actually was the one who convinced them to renovate this old warehouse in the Pearl District. It was an early 20th century building that I think had originally been built for the Fuller Paint Company, but for decades into the late 90s, it was what you would call a cold storage warehouse, like in a way like one big refrigerator. And, people would walk by this building and maybe think it was nothing special, just one of those kind of old warehouses like they have a few of in that section of town, particularly along 13th Avenue in the Pearl. And Brad Klopfel really saw that you could renovate this building from the inside out and kind of create architecture by what you take away as much as by what you build. And so he started taking out whole floors and built a kind of atrium inside, put a bunch of big skylights in.
Beautiful inside when you walk in there. And I could see where that's perfect for an advertising agency like Wyden and Kennedy when they have a client come. The architect herself sort of blows the client away, and they look at that and probably think, well, if they can do this, maybe I want to advertise with them.
Uh-huh.
It makes a statement when you walk in there.
Yeah, and it's this hive of creative activity. Like you look across this atrium and you see all kinds of people doing interesting things, and they've filled it with all kinds of really fun public art. Like a few years ago, I did an article about an artist who built a kind of nest, really. Like he and all these other people collecting all these twigs from out in the forest and building this nest that really just kind of functioned as a conference room, but it just like the building becomes a vessel for all that stuff. There's another artwork in there where they just got thousands of push pins like you'd use for a bulletin board, and they wrote out the phrase "fail harder." And so there's all kinds of just fun stuff in there, and you look across that atrium and you see what other people are doing, and you get a real sense that this is a company where all kinds of fun ideas are going on, where they're making a Dodge trucks commercial in one building, in one room, and they're doing a fun little ESPN commercial in another room, and you just feel the kind of creative energy. And so I think that's another mark of good architecture, is what it enables for the people inside.
Especially a business like that where architecture helps the creative environment, which is pretty awesome. We have about 5 minutes left, and we would be remiss if we didn't just mention some other parts of architecture of Portland. And you said if we had time in this conversation, let's talk about the Keller Fountain.
Yeah.
What's its official name?
Well, when you asked me to pick 5 for this list, in a way, like, my first thought was the Keller Fountain, originally called the Forecourt Fountain. But I thought, well, Jeff, it's not actually a building, so am I allowed to choose it? But I'm really glad you mentioned this, because maybe there's no place in Portland I love more. It's actually where I had my earliest memory in Portland. I grew up in McMinnville, and I remember my mom taking me to Keller Auditorium, what was then called Civic Auditorium, to see a traveling Broadway musical. But I remember on that day, it was a warm Sunday afternoon, and we got there early, and so we went to this Keller Fountain, the Forecourt Fountain, and there were kids frolicking in the water on a summer's day. And I thought, actually, I don't need to see that musical. I would rather just stay here and play in the fountain. And it's a beautiful fountain when you're standing outside it on the sidewalk, like it's a full city block that kind of is inspired by a Cascade Mountain fountain like you'd see in the Columbia Gorge.
And the architect behind that, Lawrence Halprin, a lot of folks may not be familiar, but he's extremely famous for his urban fountains, right?
Yeah, he's arguably the most significant American landscape architect of the 20th century, and he was based out of San Francisco, and so a lot of his most famous work is down there, like Ghirardelli Square, or there's one of his designs in New York City called FDR Plaza or FDR Park, and he really was known for taking nature, taking the inspiration of nature and presenting it in this kind of modernist language. And so that's what you see in the Keller Fountain. It in some ways it looks like a cascade waterfall from the gorge, but it is in this kind of cubist, blocky language, design language. And so it's clearly not trying to directly imitate nature. You can't truly replicate nature, but it does a wonderful job of kind of taking that inspiration and then reimagining it as this kind of cubist fountain. And it's beautiful, and then yet it's also a great experience. You don't just stand on the sidewalk and look at it. You descend down from the sidewalk, and you really get enveloped by it. You feel the mist, and you hear the white noise, and sometimes if you get far enough down there, you forget you're in the city at all.
Yeah. Now, we have about 1 minute left. The KOIN building located right next to the Keller, and my bosses would get very angry at me if you didn't kind of put KOIN on your list a little bit. But what makes the KOIN building so unique?
I really like the KOIN building. If you're looking at a picture of Portland's skyline, it is the most unmistakable, identifiable building on the Portland skyline. That's really because the way it sort of tapers to a little pyramid at the top. Also, the fact that it's made out of brick. Like, sometimes when you look at the skyscrapers that are made of glass and are just all kind of rectangular forms, like, they can be beautiful, but they all kind of start to look like each other. And the KOIN building is one of those few that really is built out of a different material and tapers toward the top. There's a building in New York City that did this, most famously the Chrysler Building, but that's maybe the most beloved skyscraper in New York for that same reason. And so, I will absolutely acknowledge what your bosses are saying, that KOIN does deserve a special place when we're talking about architecture in Portland or downtown Portland architecture. It's not the tallest building in downtown Portland, but I will say it's the most distinct tall building we have.
Brian, it's just been fascinating talking with you, and I want you to come back, and maybe we can do a whole half hour just on Pietro Belluschi. What do you think?
Sounds great.
Yeah, and we can talk about a lot of other buildings too. People just love talking about architecture. I hope everyone enjoyed this KOIN conversation with my good friend Brian Libby. He's going to be back, and we'll talk more architecture in future conversations. Brian, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure.